agenda on the session and changing the tone a little bit. And we are pleased to invite the second presenter of today's session, Mr. Graham Horn from TechnipFMC, who will share his views from the private sector, particularly coming down from a technology provider standpoint. So Mr. Horn is the Senior Vice President of Surface Product Management at TechnipFMC. He oversees the product strategy for surface organization, and he sponsors the surface decarbonization and energy transition team, which looks into how the organization can influence and contribute to more energy transition landscape. Today, he will be sharing with us his perspective in a presentation titled Transforming Brilliant Innovation to Industrialization Success. Mr. Horn, please.
Good morning. So thank you very much. Humbled to be here with you all today to participate in the conference and to be with such distinguished company. Let me try and share the screen here.
Good.
See it okay? All right. Okay. So as said, I'm representing TechnipFMC, an oil and gas service company that has been here in Singapore for the past 45 years. We've been very used to partnering with companies like Exxon, trying to overcome some of the challenges that the oil and gas has represented over many years. But we're transitioning towards we transitioned in the process of transition towards decarbonization in oil and gas and renewables. So with that, I'm going to move on with my screen. Oops, sorry. So I think the first thing to think about is what are we actually trying to achieve? And I think the thing we need to think about is we're trying to really achieve lower emissions fast. You know, decarbonizing is all about reducing emissions. So that's what the target there for us is for us. And to do that, obviously we need science. We need science to deliver us this clean energy transition and low carbon economy. We need brilliant ideas to make that happen. But then we need to accelerate that science into industrial solutions that are economically acceptable, because we talked a little bit about today how the world has a real problem to deal with. That said, we have to also find ways to get people to buy into that and to take that forward and to accept that at a social level, because it's really all about transformation, as it were. And then, once we've got an industrial solution, you actually need to get that to be deployed. And I think that's the piece that we really need to think about as we go forward. So I'm taking a slightly different spin from where we're talking about a lot of exciting technology and a lot of challenges that we're facing. I think there's some other challenges we have to consider as well. So the traditional approach we've taken to product development is really too slow. We're in this race against time. We're trying to reduce our carbon footprint. It's not a Singapore problem. It's not an ASEAN problem. It's a global problem, and it's going to impact us all. As we said, many of the presentators have said today, there's many competing technologies and solutions out there to solving carbon reduction. It's not obvious, quite frankly, which ones are going to be economically and commercially successful, and there's surely no silver bullet to solving this problem. Quite frankly, public-private funding, they're confused and struggling really where to invest. There's so many choices in which we should invest in. And as we just heard from Adeline, the billion-dollar question is what's the carbon tax going to be? And this is the question that's been asked around the world. There's very few people come out and declared what's going to happen. The rules around this are vague and unaligned, and they will have an impact on which are the economical solutions that we're going to adopt. And lastly, I think we need to recognize, as we talked about earlier, energy drives living standards, but it also drives wealth. And so by nature, it's very subject to political pressures, which makes it a very challenging thing for us to actually collaborate on at a global level. This is something I think you will all be very familiar with, the technology readiness level chart. I'm showing you one here on a scale of 0 to 7, typically used in the oil and gas business. And the reason I wanted to talk about this was to set the tone of the next few slides, but to talk about how there's a component of this is really in an academic type world. There's a component of this that really requires external funding as we move into the TL 3, 4, 5. And then there's an industrial partner requirement in order to actually take that product through to where it needs to be, delivering it to the industry so it can actually be used and make an impact. And I think that's also something we need to think about. Successful projects move from TR1 to TR2 to 3, all the way through to 7. And as they go through this process, the number of projects diminishes. We take off projects as they become, just don't meet the objectives, don't meet the rules, don't meet the targets. So, as we're thinking about that, we need to think with TRL 0 to 2, and they need to be done quickly. They need to be done fast. We talked about how we can't put invention on a schedule, and I absolutely agree with that. And we just need to have as many people trying to invent what we can as possible and bring those great ideas forward so that we can actually go through and, and do a triage at this level. We then need to take it through into TR3, 4. This starts to need a bit more serious funding. And that funding can come from public, and it's great to hear the efforts coming around A-Star, which is definitely going to help in this area. It can also come from corporate at this time. But as we go into 5 and 6, we are definitely needing corporate to be more involved and corporate partners to be more involved, because we need to start finding sites where we can deploy the technology and actually take it forward in its readiness plan, develop it further, eventually getting it up to really needing a commercial sponsor to take it through to TRL 7. And we got to remember that we're not making any impact on carbon reduction until we actually get to TRL 7 on my scale. And that's something I think is very important. We can have brilliant projects coming through an earlier stage, but if they don't get past that earlier stage, or if they take a long time to get past that earlier stage, they're not helping us achieve our ultimate goal, reducing emissions. So we've talked, we've seen slides already today on this valley of death, as they call it, and I think it's an important thing to think about, because there's a transition phase that takes place at this stage, and I've kept my TRLs here along the bottom for you. But as we move out of academia and through that phase of public funding and start to move towards private funding, all too often there's too much time lost in that space. And that's something that we really need to consider. How can we compress the valley of death? How can we make that smaller so that we can make the time to get to TRL 7 faster? So we can't put inventions on a timetable, but we can accelerate the development of those inventions and proof of those inventions to take them through to TRL 7, which I think is the piece that a lot of focus needs to start moving towards. So, the steps and the needs, TRL 0 to 2, make it easy for the ideas to be considered from different sources. Make it low cost. Let's test many ideas quickly, transparently. Let's get that out on the table. What could we do out there to really make a difference? Let's make prototype testing simple and effective. So A-Star, that's great. That's definitely something that can help us here. And let's start thinking about, from an early phase, how are we going to complete that small scale field trial? We need somebody who's going to take that into the field and be able to use that and improve that technology. And then as we prove the technology, we've got to move it up into a full scale trial. So we again need that same partner or a different partner to work with us through that process. And then really understand how we can, optimize that production system, how that works in a true operational environment. And lastly, and we haven't talked about this at all today, is once we've got something which is optimized, industrialized, functioning in a full scale environment, we plans has created that full-scale industrial deployment. And I think that is all too often not considered at the early stages, and it helps when it is considered at the early stages. I like to describe, I work obviously in product management, so I'm excited by this, but I think that's really the job of product management, is to be the glue that pulls together all of these phases in a more effective manner and considers things like, how are we going to industrialize what we're doing here? How are we going to sell it? How are we going to take it to the market so the market can actually use it? How are we going to service it? These are all things that we cannot really ignore. Product management, I'm sure many of you know this as well, but it's really a collaboration. It's all about a collaborative effort. It's all about bringing the customer's needs, translating them into something which is manageable, getting that input into the technologists, into the scientists, into the technologists, so they can take that product forward and develop it. But at the same time, really looking at the business end of things so that we can organize, where are we going to make it? How are we going to make it? How are we going to go about commercializing this product? How are we going to take it forward in a different light? And how are we going to get organized around that product to make it successful? You know, and what I think really works is when we can get early collaboration. So we've talked a lot about collaboration today, and I think that's very important. But we really need to focus on that early collaboration between academia, the supplier or the integrator, and the customer. And if you think about that customer, it's energy companies and it's the public as well. I mean, there's many different forms that that customer can take, and we need to address their needs. And I think that's something we need to consider carefully as we're taking forward the different subjects here. So we need to find a path forward and a way to establish trust, because this really only works when trust is established between the different branches here. And I think we're talking about that in this forum has been very effective talking about that today. And I think is exactly the subjects that need to be talked about. But we need to create that trust that the academics want to share their ideas. Obviously, they want to get recognition for those ideas. That's important for them and what they're doing. But they need to be able to not get hung up on taking that knowledge forward. There needs to be industrial partners to make that go forward faster. So how are we going to take that forward faster? Who are we going to partner up with? What are the things that fit for all of us? And what does that customer really need from us? What are we really trying to achieve when we look at these solutions? So I think it's good to think about the full cycle early in the phase and actually form those partnerships if possible early in the phase. It'll offer us the greatest opportunity, I believe, for success. So in conclusion today, there's no single solution. We need lots of different solutions to reduce carbon intensity. We need to really challenge conventional thinking and be really agile about how we bring our solutions through to TRL 7. Economic adoption of a solution is required to make that material difference in carbon reduction. Without it being economically acceptable, it will not have the impact that we want. Establish those focused partnerships early, based them on collaboration, trust, and try to look at what does success look like for all of the parties that are part of that collaboration, because that's when you're going to succeed, if everyone feels they're winning. I think there's a need to agree on a short list of ideas quickly. That doesn't mean we have to shortlist all the ideas, but inside that partnership, they need to decide what are the things that they're going to work at as a partnership and collaborate upon. And it's not just about technology. Technology is, or science and technology, very important, but how are we going to industrialize that? How are we going to commercialize that? How are we going to make it economic so we'll get acceptance of this in a broader state? And how can we fast track those prototypes into full-scale industrial pilots? Because there's all too often too much time lost in this phase. And we've, in the oil and gas business, and I think about the early days of subsea production, a lot of time was lost. And as we moved forward in the space and the collaboration improved between suppliers and companies and really got very tight, we're actually able to accelerate that phase quite nicely. and make a significant impact, which is why we saw in really 20 years, the beginnings of subsea drilling moved to becoming a very normal way for us to do business in the oil and gas market, and something that was something very complicated and very big task that was taken on, and very challenging. So I think this is, we've got very similar examples that we're facing today as we look at alternative energies and decarbonizing the footprint that we have today. And lastly, I do believe that there is a need to leverage some of the principles of product management to help accelerate those plans. There's some skills and tools there, some competency there that can really help these things move forward the right way, and actually also help try and keep some of those projects not only in budget but on the right timeline as well. I think that's part of the challenge that we all face. Okay, so with that, that's my presentation.
Thank you, Graham, for your insightful perspective and definitely your time for today. I'm sure our researchers will have drawn inspiration from your perspectives. So I'm just having a quick look at the Q&A box. I don't think there are any questions at this moment, and we are running behind time. So in the interest of time, I think we can take any questions from the audience via email, right? And we can now move on to the next presentation. Thank you, Graham, for your time, and again, a very insightful perspective. Thank you.